Hello and welcome to this sixth video in our series examining Martin Luther's The Freedom of a Christian. This video is posted for Sunday, November 15th, and our conversation today is about paragraphs 70 to 74, and in the study guide, that's section 8, pages 32 to 34. Just looking ahead briefly to next week, November 22nd, we'll be looking at paragraphs 75 to 77, which correspond to section 9 of the study guide, pages 35 to 36. So again, paragraphs 75 to 77 for next week, and pages 35 to 36 in the study guide, that is section 9. Earlier today, dropped my book. Earlier today, the Church Council had a retreat. And one of the members, we were talking about the video, and he said, where are you? Where are you doing this broadcast? I'm on the third floor of our home, which also functions as a guest room, but primarily it functions as an office or a study for me. And right now, this little space that you see that I was standing in front of for the first two videos, I'm now seated in a little reading nook where I often grade papers or prepare sermons or comments or make posts like this. So you can see, very briefly, excuse the mess, but it is often used, the bed when we don't have guests is used often as a file cabinet for myself. And I get to sit here outside the window looking down at the street below. So welcome. Now you know where I'm speaking to you from, and maybe when COVID's over, we'll have an opportunity to have parties again, and we'll look forward to welcoming you to our home. So let's turn to our study for today, which is going to look at paragraphs 70 to 74. And here Martin Luther is making his transition in the text from discussions about the inner person and the outer person. Earlier on, we made this distinction between coram Deo, that is who we are before God, and then the coram mundum, who we are before the world or in the eyes of the world. And Luther has spent the treatise so far, these 70 paragraphs, speaking primarily of where humans stand in relation to God, in what sense, if at all, we could speak of humans meriting or earning God's love. And as we've seen, the answer is there is no merit on our own that we generate. God loves us, but that's because of God's own nature, because God created us and created male and female in his image, that we bear the mark of God. And so, of course, God loves us as an extension of who we are as creatures. But again, this speaks to more of God as creator, who delights in creation, who loves his creatures, and despite the fall, still loves us, even though we've lost original union with God, even though we've broken that sense of original justice. We have misused freedom in a way that God does not intend. These are all, properly speaking, theologically, sins. We are separated from God, not for anything God does, but for decisions, habits, perspectives that we perpetuate, that remove ourselves from the will of God. Remember, for Christians, for Luther, for the larger tradition, is based on that biblical idea. The fundamental problem with humans is that we are God's creatures but don't want to acknowledge our creaturehood. That the first and original sin, as it were, was to try to be like God, to have the knowledge of good and evil, where we are unable to bear that responsibility. And so we are creatures, but creatures who don't like to be reminded that we are creatures. And so the first and original sin is idolatry. That God has given us a nature, God has given us a purpose, which we so often reject or distort or think of ourselves as in charge. So Luther begins, so to speak, with a prologue of any kind of theological language, that when we speak of who we are as humans and where we stand in relation to God and others, we began by noting, first of all, our flaws. This isn't some kind of masochistic sense, but again, it's a reality check. It's naming the fact that humans are typically are not humble. We tend to act out of self-interest and exploitation of other people. Now, there are whole philosophical systems based on this idea as a good, and trying to harness or tap into that. We can't get into that for this discussion, but I think it's fair to say that theologically speaking, in the Jewish tradition and in the Christian tradition, this is not a fundamental good. Our disconnectedness from God and disconnectedness from neighbor makes us less than fully human. So all that to say, Luther has spoken about that in the treatise so far. Now he's turning our attention, having emphasized the radical essential role of grace and God's unconditional love for us, by which we are made worthy, that our original worthiness was founded in God's love, and that we are remade or transformed or stand before God as worthy only as a testament to God's goodness. Nothing we can do can earn or merit God's love. In fact, we already have it. And that is the basis for our actions and our movements going forward. At that point, it's that moving forward, going forward, what do we do now that we understand that we cannot earn or merit? We can make no claims on God of our own, as if there was some part of us that was sort of encapsulated, independent, by which I can do this. Once we realize that it's all grace and it's all saturated by God's unconditional love, in what sense then do we recontextualize, reframe our outer actions, our service to neighbor, our service to others? That is coram mundum, that is who we are in the eyes of the world. And so that's why this subheading is added here just before paragraph 70 on the outer person. I want to share with you an analogy that may help. It may be a little long for this video, but as I was reading this again in preparation, it was an example from my own life and maybe yours too. When I was learning how to ride a bike, I wasn't very physically coordinated. It took a while. And my dad, of course, would help me. There'd be training wheels, and then Dad would sort of run along beside me and hold the bike and those kind of things. There was a time, like a lot of kids, I was like, I can do this. Don't push me. Don't try to bounce me. Let go. I can do this. And wobbly and all this kind of stuff. And I got better. And then the training wheels came off, and Dad was still, sort of guiding or protecting. And I remember being very petulant as a kid, like just saying, leave me alone, I can do this. And pedaling and steering and just going along and saying, yes, I've done this all by myself. I can do it. And that was a proud moment for me, probably at about 6 or 7. And then watching my dad help my younger sister, who's about 4 years younger than me, watching her go through that same thing as a human characteristic, and insisting that Dad not help her, that she could do this by herself at a certain point once the training wheels came off. But what I watched is my dad still standing in the back, balancing the seat as my sister began to steer and pedal. And yes, she was steering, and yes, she was pedaling on her own, and her eyes were focused forward, and she was insistent that she was autonomous and free. But what I wasn't able to see until I was older and watched my dad help my sister is that he was standing there still running alongside behind, guiding and balancing the bike. And certainly Dad was doing that for me. And it becomes an analogy for our own understanding that yes, the will begins to function. Yes, we begin to pedal and steer, but we are never at a point where we are completely free of God's grace and mercy. If we look at paragraph 70, Luther begins by asking a rhetorical question. So someone might say, okay, I have this freedom, I have this unconditional love, I don't earn or merit God's love, so why do any good works at all? And Luther is reminding us that we were made for good works. We were made to live in the universe that God has made, and God has showed us how to live in this universe. And so, of course, our interactions toward others, our disposition toward God, does lead to a fundamental transformation. This is a problem, I think, in a lot of contemporary Lutheran theology. I'd say the last 100 years. You know, we've become in some way so careful about not talking about good works or merit from good works, which is true, but we forget the other half of Luther's argument here, is that we are, yes, we are free as Christians, but as Christians, we are also subject to God, servant to God, and subject or servant to our neighbor. The reason we love God and love our neighbor, though, are totally different. We don't do it to earn God's love, but rather these come out of a spontaneous expression of knowing what it is to be loved unconditionally. So Luther is now, as we make this transition to think about our works in the world, is carefully admonishing us that yes, there is a transition because of grace. We are transformed, we are changed in our baptism, moving from inevitable death to inevitable life through Christ. We move from those who have self-exiled from God to a God who has brought us into union with God and shown us the way of union with others. That reconciliation, all God's work, then becomes the basis for then our response in the world. Again, not to earn it, not to be worthy of that love. Again, that speaks to merit. But in a way that when you think about your best friend, a spouse, if you're married, someone very important in your life, if I were to ask you when their birthday is, I guarantee you that you know when their birthday is, not out of obligation, not out of fear, but out of a spontaneous love and a way of expressing that joy for who they are. And I bet that you call them on their birthday, you send them cards, you send them presents, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but out of that spontaneous expression, because they are so dear to you, because they mean so much to you, that their love is the foundation of who you are and how you relate in the world. You can't help but to share that joy, that excitement with them, and let them know how meaningful they are in their life. Such that if you're doing it out of fear or obligation, I think most of us would say it's probably time to analyze that relationship. There must be something flawed or some misunderstanding in that relationship. But when we know true love, when we know true friendship, it can't help but to express itself. And this is the context in which Luther is speaking. So anyone who says, I'm saved by grace, therefore I don't need to do any good works, Luther would say, I really don't think you understand the nature of God's grace and God's transformative compassion for you. So if we look at paragraph 73, he begins, the inner person, conformed to God and created in the image of God through faith, is joyful and glad on account of Christ, in whom all good things have been conferred upon such a one. Because of this, that person has only one concern, to serve God joyfully, with boundless love, and with no thought of earning anything. While acting this way, immediately after the inner creature offends a contrary will in its own flesh, one that serves the world and tries seeking after that which belongs to it. So our fleshy nature, as it were, which once we used as a vocabulary, as a shorthand to talk about our propensity to sin and away from God and away from others, now transformed our fleshy nature, or the realities of our material world, how we spend our money, how we use our resources and our gifts and talents as a church, as a society. These become transformed and renewed and are employed as gifts and talents to be employed to service our nature. And this is reaffirmed on paragraph 74 under the right suppositions that this work is done. I won't read it to you because we only have about 15 seconds left, such is our time. But read that, think about that transformation, use the comments if you want, And for next Sunday, we'll be looking at paragraph 75 to 77, and we'll get into this a little bit more. God bless you. See you soon.